The bullet tore through Lydia Morgan's left calf just as she crested the ridge overlooking the Missouri River, and she knew immediately that she was going to die out here alone in the wilderness, miles from St. Louis, with nothing but prairie grass and the merciless August sun bearing down on her shoulders. She had been stupid to run, stupid to think she could escape her stepfather's debts by fleeing into the territories west of the city. And now she was paying for that foolishness with blood that soaked through her torn skirt and painted the dry earth beneath her boots a dark, terrible red. The shot had come from somewhere behind her, from the men her stepfather had sent to drag her back to settle his gambling obligations, the only way a man like him knew how, by selling off anything of value he could get his hands on, including his dead wife's daughter. Lydia pressed her hand against the wound and bit down on her lip hard enough to taste copper. The pain was extraordinary, radiating up through her entire leg in waves that made her vision swim and her stomach turn, but she forced herself to keep moving. She could see the settlement in the distance, perhaps a mile away, where smoke rose from chimneys and the promise of help beckoned like a mirage. If she could just make it there, she might have a chance. The alternative was unthinkable. Behind her, she heard voices calling out, harsh and demanding. They were closer than she had hoped. Her stepfather's hired men were not the kind to give up easily, not when they had been promised payment for her return. She half ran, half stumbled down the far side of the ridge, her injured leg threatening to buckle with each step. The tall grass whipped against her skirts, and the August heat pressed down on her like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. The year was 1873, and St. Louis had grown into a thriving city on the western edge of civilization, but out here in the territories beyond its borders, the law was still something flexible and uncertain. A woman alone was vulnerable in ways that made Lydia's chest tighten with fear. She had left the city 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bag of provisions she had managed to steal from her stepfather's pantry. She had thought she could make it to one of the smaller settlements, find work, disappear into the vast expanse of the frontier, where men like her stepfather could not reach her. That hope was dying with each labored step. Her leg gave out when she was still half a mile from the settlement, her knee hitting the ground hard enough to jar her teeth. She tried to stand, tried to force her body to obey, but the injured calf would not support her weight. The bullet had done more damage than she had initially realized, tearing through muscle and possibly nicking bone. Blood continued to seep through her fingers no matter how hard she pressed, and the edges of her vision had started to darken in a way that terrified her more than the voices behind her. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, dragging her useless leg behind her. The prairie grass was tall enough to hide her if she stayed low, but it also meant she could not see how close her pursuers had gotten. Every sound made her flinch. Every bird call or rustle of wind through the grass could be them closing in. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and mixing with the tears she refused to acknowledge. The settlement remained stubbornly distant, mocking her efforts. A quarter mile now, maybe less, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Her arms were shaking from exertion, her hands scraped raw from the rough ground. The pain in her leg had evolved from sharp agony to a deep throbbing ache that made her nauseous. She knew she was going into shock, knew that even if she somehow made it to help, she might not survive the blood loss. She collapsed face first into the grass, unable to go any further. Her body simply would not respond anymore. She lay there gasping, tasting dirt and her own desperation, and waited for the men to find her. At least it would be over soon. At least she would not have to endure what her stepfather had planned for her, sold off to some stranger to settle a debt she had never asked to carry. The sound of a horse approaching made her tense, but she did not have the strength to lift her head. This was it then, the end of her brief, desperate flight to freedom. She closed her eyes and tried to think of her mother, dead these past 2 years from fever. Tried to imagine that there might be something beyond this life where she could see her again. Jesus Christ! The voice was male, deep and rough with surprise. "Miss, can you hear me?" It was not one of her stepfather's men. She knew their voices, had heard them often enough lurking around the house, discussing business with him. This was someone else. She managed to turn her head slightly, squinting up against the sun at the figure standing over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. A cowboy, by the look of him, probably heading into the settlement for supplies. "Please," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "Help me." He was kneeling beside her in an instant, his hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her injured leg. She could see his face now, weathered and tanned from years in the sun, with dark eyes that held a sharp intelligence. He could not have been much older than his mid-20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble, and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat. "You have been shot," he said, and there was anger in his voice, though she could tell it was not directed at her. "Who did this?" "Men," she gasped out. "Following me. Please, I cannot go back. I would rather die." His jaw tightened, and he glanced back the way she had come. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. I do not know." He nodded once, decisive, and began tearing strips from his own shirt to bind her leg. His movements were efficient, practiced, the actions of someone who had dealt with injuries before. "My name is Xavier Nichols," he said as he worked. "I am going to get you out of here, but this is going to hurt. I am sorry." Before she could ask what he meant, he had scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. The movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg, and she could not stop the cry that escaped her lips. She felt him tense, felt the way his arms tightened around her protectively. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it hurts. Just hold on to me." She wrapped her arms around his neck instinctively, pressing her face against his shoulder as he began to walk. His horse, a large bay gelding, stood waiting nearby, but Xavier did not try to mount. Instead, he simply kept walking, carrying her toward the settlement with long, steady strides that ate up the distance faster than she would have thought possible. "Your horse," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "Thunder will follow," he replied, "and I can move faster on foot through this terrain while carrying you. Just focus on breathing." The world had narrowed to the rhythm of his steps, the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, the way his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. She could feel herself drifting, consciousness slipping away in increments, but his voice kept pulling her back. "Stay with me," he said. "What is your name?" "Lydia Morgan." "Well, Lydia Morgan, you are going to be fine. Do you hear me? You are going to be just fine." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself trust in the certainty of his words, but the darkness at the edges of her vision kept creeping closer. Behind them, she heard shouting. Her stepfather's men had found their trail. Xavier heard it too. She felt his body shift, felt him adjust his grip on her as he quickened his pace. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There is a doctor in the settlement, Doc Henderson. He is a good man, served as a field surgeon during the war. He will take care of you, but I need you to stay conscious for me, Lydia. Can you do that?" "I will try," she whispered, though she was not certain she could keep that promise. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Tell me why those men are after you." So she did, her voice weak and halting, painting him a picture of her life in fragments. She told him about her mother, kind and gentle, who had married the wrong man in a moment of loneliness after Lydia's father died. She told him about her stepfather, Edmund Morgan, a gambler and a drunk who had run through her mother's modest inheritance, and then turned to darker methods to maintain his lifestyle. She told him about the night 3 days ago when she had overheard him negotiating with a man named Silas Croft, agreeing to hand her over in exchange for clearing his debts. "He said I was young and pretty enough that Croft could make back his money and more," she said, her words bitter with shame and rage. "He did not even have the decency to pretend it was anything other than what it was. I was nothing but property to him, something to be sold." Xavier's arms tightened around her, and she felt the tension radiating through his entire frame. "Your stepfather is a coward and worse," he said flatly, "and you were right to run. You are not property, Lydia Morgan. You are not something to be bought and sold." The conviction in his voice made something in her chest ache. She had barely known this man for a handful of minutes, and yet he was treating her with more respect and care than her stepfather had shown in 2 years. She found herself clinging to him a little tighter, drawing strength from his presence even as her own body continued to fail her. The voices behind them were getting closer. She could make out individual words now, crude suggestions about what they would do when they caught up with her. Xavier's jaw clenched, but he did not slow his pace. The settlement was close now, close enough that she could see individual buildings, could hear the sounds of life carrying across the prairie. "Just a little further," Xavier said. "You are doing so well, Lydia. Stay with me." She was trying, truly she was, but the world kept tilting sideways. The pain in her leg had faded to a distant throb, which she knew was not a good sign. She could feel the wetness of blood soaking through the makeshift bandage Xavier had tied, could feel it dripping down to stain his shirt. He had to be exhausted, carrying her all this way, but he showed no signs of slowing. They crossed into the settlement just as her stepfather's men broke through the tree line behind them. Xavier called out, his voice carrying with the kind of authority that made people stop and pay attention. "I need the doctor! This woman has been shot!" People emerged from buildings, their faces curious and concerned. An older man with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles hurried forward, his medical bag already in hand. "Bring her to my office," he said, gesturing toward a building at the end of the street. "Quickly now!" Xavier followed without hesitation, still carrying her as though she was something precious and fragile. Behind them, she could hear her stepfather's men entering the settlement, could hear them demanding that she be handed over. But other voices rose in response, hard and unyielding. The people here might be simple settlers, but they clearly had their own sense of justice. The doctor's office was small but clean, with examination table against one wall and shelves lined with bottles and medical equipment. Xavier laid her down gently, his hands lingering for just a moment before he stepped back to let the doctor work. She immediately felt the loss of his warmth, felt the cold fear creeping back in without his steady presence to anchor her. "Stay," she heard herself say, reaching out blindly. "Please do not leave me." His hand closed around hers, large and calloused and solid. "I am not going anywhere," he promised. "I am right here." Dr. Henderson worked quickly, cutting away her skirt to expose the wound. His face was grave as he examined it, but his touch was gentle and sure. "The bullet went clean through," he said. "That is good, but she has lost a lot of blood, and there is risk of infection. I need to clean and stitch this, and it is going to hurt. Xavier, can you hold her steady?" Xavier moved without hesitation, positioning himself at the head of the table so he could grip her shoulders. She turned her face toward him, and he leaned down so his face was close to hers. "Look at me," he said softly. "Just keep looking at me, Lydia. Do not look at what he is doing. Just focus on me." She locked eyes with him, losing herself in the dark depths of his gaze. She could see flecks of gold in his irises, could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. When the doctor began cleaning the wound, the pain was excruciating, but Xavier's voice kept her grounded. "I grew up on a ranch about 50 miles north of here," he said, his tone conversational, as though they were sitting down to tea rather than living through one of the worst moments of her life. "My father breeds horses, some of the finest in Missouri. I have been working cattle drives for the past few years, moving herds up to Kansas. Just got back from Abilene yesterday, actually." "Tell me about the ranch," she gasped out, desperate for anything to distract her from what was happening to her leg. So he did. He painted her a picture with his words, describing rolling hills and endless sky, horses running wild through green pastures, the smell of hay and leather and home. He told her about his mother, who ran the household with gentle efficiency, and his younger sister Clara, who at 21 had more spirit than sense and could outride most of the ranch hands. He told her about the peace of watching the sun rise over the prairie, about the satisfaction of working with his hands and seeing tangible results from his labor. His voice washed over her like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her fear. She found herself wanting to see this place he described, wanting to experience the life he painted with such obvious love. It seemed like something from a dream, so far removed from the nightmare her own life had become. The stitching seemed to take forever, each pull of the needle a fresh agony that made her whimper despite her best efforts to stay quiet. Xavier never once looked away from her, never once let go of her shoulders, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. When it was finally over, when Dr. Henderson stepped back and began bandaging the wound properly, she felt something break loose inside her chest. The tears she had been holding back for 3 days spilled over, running hot down her temples and into her hair. "You are so brave," Xavier murmured, reaching up to wipe the tears away with his thumb. "So incredibly brave, Lydia. The worst is over now. You are safe." But even as he said it, they could hear raised voices outside, her stepfather's men arguing with what sounded like half the settlement. Dr. Henderson moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. There are 4 men out there demanding we hand over a young woman who they claim is a runaway, he said. They are insisting she belongs to Edmund Morgan. She belongs to no one, Xavier said, his voice hard as iron. She is her own person, and those men shot her while she was fleeing for her life. That is not quite how they are telling it, the doctor replied. They are claiming she stole from her stepfather, and that they were simply trying to stop a thief. Lydia felt her heart sink. Of course they would lie. Men like them always did, twisting the truth until it served their purposes. I did not steal anything, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I only took some food for the journey. Everything else I left behind. I believe you, Xavier said immediately. Then he turned to the doctor. What would you need to speak on her behalf? To testify that she was shot while fleeing? Dr. Henderson removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully. I can certainly attest to her injuries and the fact that she was shot from behind, which suggests she was running away rather than attacking. But in matters of family law, the courts tend to side with male guardians, especially when it comes to young women. She is not going back to him, Xavier said flatly. I do not care what the law says. The doctor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There might be another way. If Miss Morgan were under the protection of another family, if she had somewhere to go that was not her stepfather's house, the court would be less likely to force her return, especially given the evidence of violence. She can come to my family's ranch, Xavier said without hesitation. My mother is always looking for help around the house, and we can certainly provide employment and protection. Lydia stared at him, stunned. You do not even know me. Why would you do this? He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Because it is the right thing to do, he said simply. Because no one should be treated the way your stepfather has treated you. And because I would like the chance to know you, if you will allow it. Before she could respond, the door to the doctor's office burst open. 3 men crowded into the small space, their clothes dusty from the trail and their faces hard with anger. She recognized them immediately. Garrett, Dutch, and Samuel, all of them frequent visitors to her stepfather's house, and all of them willing to do whatever dirty work he required for the right price. There she is, Garrett said, pointing at Lydia. Miss Morgan, your stepfather is mighty worried about you. Time to come home now. I am not going anywhere with you, Lydia said, forcing strength into her voice even though she was terrified. Now you do not really have a choice in the matter, Dutch said, moving toward the examination table. Your stepfather is your legal guardian, and what he says goes. So, you can come along quiet, or we can make this difficult. Xavier stepped between Dutch and the table, his posture deceptively relaxed but radiating danger. The lady said she is not going with you. I suggest you respect that. Dutch looked Xavier up and down dismissively. This is none of your concern, Cowboy. This is family business. She is bleeding from a bullet wound that one of you gave her, Xavier replied, his voice dangerously quiet. That makes it everyone's concern. You shot an unarmed woman in the back while she was running for her life. That is not family business. That is attempted murder. She is a thief, Samuel put in. Stole from her own stepfather. We were just trying to stop her. What did she steal? Dr. Henderson asked, his tone mild but his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. The 3 men exchanged glances. Valuables? Garrett said vaguely. Family heirlooms and such. That is a lie, Lydia said. I took nothing but some bread and dried meat. You can search my bag if you like. Everything I own is in it, and there is nothing of value. The girl is clearly distraught, Dutch said. Does not know what she is saying. She has been through an ordeal, and she needs to be back with her family where she can be properly cared for. If Edmund Morgan cared about her welfare, he would not have tried to sell her to Silas Croft to settle his gambling debts, Xavier said coldly. The 3 men went very still. That is a serious accusation, Garrett said slowly. It is the truth, Lydia said. I heard him agree to hand me over to Croft in exchange for clearing what he owed. He told Croft I was young and pretty enough to make him a profit. Dr. Henderson's expression had gone cold. Silas Croft runs the saloon on the north edge of the city, and everyone knows what kind of business he conducts in the rooms above that saloon. He turned to face the 3 men. If what Miss Morgan is saying is true, then Edmund Morgan was attempting to sell her into prostitution. That is illegal, gentlemen, guardian or not. She is making it up, Samuel insisted. but there was a note of desperation in his voice now. She is a liar and a thief, and she will say anything to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. Then let us bring this before the marshal, Xavier suggested. Let Miss Morgan tell her story in front of witnesses, and we will see what the law has to say about it. The three men clearly had not expected that. They huddled together for a moment, conferring in low voices. Finally, Garrett turned back to face them. Mr. Morgan is not going to be happy about this. He sent us to bring his stepdaughter home, and that is what we intend to do. Over my dead body, Xavier said quietly. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Lydia could see the calculation in the three men's eyes, weighing the odds. Xavier was alone, but he had the advantage of position and purpose. And beyond that, she could see other men gathering outside the doctor's office, settlers and cowboys who had heard the commotion and come to see what was happening. Her stepfather's men were outnumbered, and they knew it. This is not over, Dutch said finally. Mr. Morgan has rights, legal rights. We will be back with the proper authorities. Please do, Dr. Henderson said. I would be more than happy to present my medical findings to any official who wishes to see them. A bullet wound in the back of the calf, consistent with someone running away. Significant blood loss and evidence of shock. This young woman was very nearly killed today, and I will gladly testify to that fact. The three men retreated, their faces dark with anger, but they left. Lydia felt herself sag with relief, the tension draining out of her so fast it left her dizzy. Xavier turned back to her immediately, his hand finding hers again. They will go back to your stepfather, he said, and he will likely try to pursue this through legal channels. We need to get ahead of that. How? Lydia asked. She felt so tired, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Her leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and the exhaustion of the past 3 days was catching up with her all at once. First, you need to rest, Dr. Henderson said firmly. You have lost a lot of blood, and your body needs time to recover. I have a room in the back where you can sleep. Xavier, if you would help me move her. Xavier lifted her again with that same careful gentleness, carrying her through a doorway into a small but comfortable room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the prairie. He laid her down on the bed as though she was made of spun glass, arranging the pillows behind her head and pulling a light blanket over her. Rest now, he said softly. When you wake up, we will figure out what comes next. But for now, just let yourself heal. She caught his hand before he could pull away. Why are you doing this? She asked again. You could have just kept riding. You could have left me there, and no one would have blamed you. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. My father always taught me that a man is measured by what he does when no one is watching, he said finally. By whether he does what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous. When I saw you lying there, bleeding and terrified, there was no choice to make. There was only what had to be done. Thank you, she whispered, for carrying me, for saving my life, for everything. He squeezed her hand gently. You do not need to thank me, Lydia. Just focus on getting better. Everything else can wait. She wanted to say more, wanted to explain the complicated tangle of emotions churning in her chest, but exhaustion was pulling her under like a tide. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts to keep them open, and the last thing she felt was Xavier's thumb brushing softly over her knuckles before sleep claimed her completely. When she woke, the light outside the window had shifted to the golden glow of late afternoon. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, could not place the clean white walls or the comfortable bed. Then the pain in her leg reminded her of everything, and the memories came flooding back in a rush that made her gasp. Easy now, a woman's voice said from beside the bed. Lydia turned her head to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair sitting in a chair pulled up close. You are safe, dear. You are in Dr. Henderson's office. My name is Martha Henderson. I am his wife. Where is Xavier? Lydia asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Martha smiled knowingly. That young man has not left the building since he brought you in. He is out in the main office with my husband and the marshal. They are discussing your situation. The marshal is here? Alarm shot through Lydia, cutting through the fog of sleep. Are they going to make me go back? Hush now, Martha said, reaching out to pat her hand. Marshal Hawkins is a good man, and he has heard your story. He is not going to force you back into a dangerous situation. But there are legalities that need to be addressed. Your stepfather is still your legal guardian until you reach the age of majority, and that gives him certain rights under the law. I will be 21 in 3 months, Lydia said desperately. Cannot I just stay here until then? Cannot I just wait until I am old enough that he has no claim on me? That may be what Marshal Hawkins suggests, Martha said gently. But it is complicated by the fact that your stepfather has filed a complaint claiming you are a thief and a runaway. He is demanding your return, and he has friends in the city government who might support him. Lydia felt tears burning at the backs of her eyes again. I did not steal anything. I swear I did not. I believe you, dear. And so does my husband, and so does Xavier Nichols. That young man was quite passionate in his defense of you. He has offered to take you to his family's ranch, to provide you with honest employment and protection. Marshal Hawkins seemed inclined to approve the arrangement, though he will need to verify some details first. I do not understand why he is being so kind to me, Lydia said softly. I am a stranger to him. Martha's smile turned knowing. Some people just have good hearts, dear, and some people recognize something special when they see it. Xavier strikes me as both. Now, can I get you anything? Some water? Something to eat? Lydia realized she was desperately thirsty and said so. Martha bustled out and returned a few minutes later with a cup of cool water and a bowl of broth. She helped Lydia sit up carefully, mindful of her injured leg, and then left her to eat in peace. The broth was simple but flavorful, and Lydia felt strength seeping back into her body with each sip. She was just finishing when there was a knock on the door. Xavier poked his head in, his expression cautious. May I come in? Please, Lydia said, setting the bowl aside. He entered, followed by a man she did not recognize. The stranger was older, perhaps in his 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and a star pinned to his vest. Marshal Hawkins, she assumed. He had the kind of face that had seen too much of humanity's worst and was tired of it. Miss Morgan, the marshal said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I have heard your story, and I have spoken with Dr. Henderson about your injuries. I have also sent a deputy back to St. Louis to investigate the claims against you and to speak with your stepfather. Until I have more information, I am placing you under the temporary protection of Xavier Nichols and his family. Do you consent to this arrangement? Lydia looked at Xavier, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Yes, she said, I do. Good. Mr. Nichols has agreed to take responsibility for your welfare and to ensure that you appear before the court if needed to address any charges. In the meantime, you are not to return to your stepfather's house or to have any contact with him. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Marshal Hawkins grunted. I do not know what the truth is yet, Miss Morgan, but I know that a woman does not get shot in the leg while fleeing unless something is badly wrong. Until I figure out what that something is, you will be safe with the Nichols family. Xavier, I will need you to sign some papers before you leave. Of course, Marshal. The two men left, and Lydia was alone again with her thoughts. Everything had happened so fast. Just this morning, she had been crawling through the grass, certain she was going to die. Now she was lying in a clean bed, her wound tended, with a stranger offering her sanctuary. It did not seem real. Xavier returned a short while later, his expression more relaxed now that the official business was done. He pulled the chair Martha had been using closer to the bed and sat down. How are you feeling? Overwhelmed, Lydia admitted, and confused and grateful. I do not even know where to start. Then do not start anywhere, Xavier said with a gentle smile. Just take things one moment at a time. Tomorrow, when the doctor says you are strong enough to travel, I will take you to my family's ranch. You will have your own room, honest work if you want it, and time to figure out what comes next. No pressure, no expectations, just a safe place to heal. What will your family think of you bringing home a stranger? They will think I did the right thing, Xavier said with confidence. My mother will fuss over you and probably feed you until you cannot eat another bite. My father will be gruff but kind, and Clara will be thrilled to have another woman around. She gets tired of being outnumbered by men. Despite everything, Lydia found herself smiling. It sounds wonderful. It is home, Xavier said simply. And for as long as you need it, it can be yours too. They talked for a while longer, Xavier telling her more about the ranch and his family, Lydia sharing bits and pieces of her own history. She told him about her real father, a kind man who had died when she was 16, leaving her and her mother alone. She told him about the happy years before that, growing up in a small house on the outskirts of St. Louis with parents who loved her. She told him about her mother's decline after her father's death, the loneliness that had driven her into Edmund Morgan's arms, and the slow realization that she had made a terrible mistake. She knew, Lydia said quietly. Toward the end, before the fever took her, she knew what kind of man he really was. She made me promise that I would not let him control my life, that I would run if I had to. I think she had been planning to leave him herself before she got sick. She sounds like a strong woman, Xavier said. She was, and she deserves so much better than what she got. Night fell, and Martha brought dinner for both of them. She seemed pleased to see them talking so comfortably, and she left them alone with a smile that made Lydia blush for reasons she could not quite name. She and Xavier ate together, their conversation flowing easily despite the strangeness of their situation. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh in spite of everything. And he listened when she talked, really listened, his attention focused entirely on her, as though she was the most interesting person in the world. It had been so long since anyone had made her feel seen. Her stepfather had treated her like furniture at best, something to be moved around and used as needed. Her mother's friends had stopped visiting after she died, uncomfortable with Edmund's presence and unwilling to get involved. Lydia had been so alone, so invisible, that she had started to wonder if she even existed outside of other people's needs and expectations. But Xavier looked at her like she mattered, like her thoughts and feelings and experiences were important. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She slept again that night, deeply and dreamlessly, her body demanding rest to heal. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window and she could hear birds singing outside. For a moment, before memory returned, she felt peaceful. Then the pain in her leg reminded her of everything, and the peace evaporated like morning mist. Dr. Henderson examined her wound after breakfast, pleased with how it was healing. "You are lucky," he said. "The bullet went clean through without hitting any major blood vessels or shattering bone. You will have a scar, and you will need to stay off that leg for at least a week, but you should make a full recovery." "Can she travel?" Xavier asked from his position by the door. "If you are careful and you do not push her too hard. She will need to rest frequently, and she absolutely cannot walk on that leg. But if you can transport her safely, I see no reason why she cannot leave today." Xavier nodded. "I will take care of her." Dr. Henderson gave him a long, measuring look. "I believe you will, son. Just remember, she has been through a significant trauma, both physical and emotional. Healing takes time." "I understand." They left an hour later, after Lydia had thanked Martha and Dr. Henderson profusely and promised to send word once she was settled. Xavier had arranged for a wagon from the settlement's livery, something with a padded bench seat and enough room for her to lie down if needed. He lifted her into it with that same careful gentleness she was coming to recognize as simply part of who he was, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. His horse, Thunder, was tied to the back of the wagon, and he nickered softly as they started moving. Xavier kept the pace slow and steady, mindful of every bump and rut in the road. They left the settlement behind, heading north into rolling prairie land that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "It is about 3 hours to the ranch," Xavier said. "Let me know if you need to stop and rest." "I will," Lydia promised. She was already tired, the simple act of getting dressed and moving from the doctor's office to the wagon having exhausted her more than she wanted to admit. But there was also a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. She was heading into the unknown, toward a future that was completely uncertain. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. They talked as they traveled, Xavier pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land. He showed her where his father had first staked his claim 25 years ago, where he and Clara had learned to ride as children, where his mother grew herbs and vegetables in a garden that she tended with fierce devotion. He painted a picture of a life built with hard work and love, and Lydia found herself hungry for it in ways she had not expected. "Tell me about Clara," she said. "What is she like?" Xavier laughed. "Headstrong and stubborn and loyal to a fault. She looks delicate, like a strong wind could blow her over. But she has more grit than most men I know. She can rope a steer, break a horse, and outshoot half the ranch hands. My father wanted her to go back east to a finishing school, learn to be a proper lady, but she refused. Said she belonged here on the ranch, and no amount of fancy education was going to change that. She sounds remarkable. She is. You two will get along well, I think. They stopped around midday to rest and eat the food Martha had packed for them. Xavier found a spot beneath a stand of cottonwood trees where the shade offered some relief from the August heat. He helped Lydia down from the wagon and settled her on a blanket he spread over the grass, propping her injured leg up on his rolled saddle to keep it elevated. "How is the pain?" he asked, offering her a canteen of water. "Bearable," she said, which was mostly true. The constant throbbing had settled into something she could manage, though she knew she would need the laudanum Dr. Henderson had sent with them once they reached the ranch. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of an ease that should not have developed so quickly between strangers. But Lydia was beginning to think that Xavier was not really a stranger at all. She felt like she had known him for years rather than days, like some part of her recognized some part of him. It was strange and unsettling and wonderful all at once. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they were packing up to leave. "Anything. Why did you not just take me to the settlement on your horse? Why did you carry me instead?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the rope he was coiling. "Because you were hurt and scared, and I thought maybe having someone hold you might make it a little less terrible. Because sometimes, when everything is falling apart, we need to know that we are not alone." He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious. "Was I wrong?" "No," Lydia said softly. "You were not wrong." They reached the ranch in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low and golden in the western sky. The house was larger than Lydia had expected, a sprawling two-story structure built of honey-colored wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Beyond it, she could see barns and outbuildings, corrals where horses moved lazily in the heat, and fields that rolled away toward distant tree-lined hills. As the wagon approached, the front door opened and people spilled out onto the porch. A woman who had to be Xavier's mother, tall and graceful, with dark hair threaded with silver. A man built like an oak tree, broad and solid, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he recognized his son. And a young woman with Xavier's eyes and a long brown braid hanging over one shoulder, who was practically bouncing with excitement. Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, immediately turning to help Lydia, but his mother reached them first, her eyes taking in Lydia's pale face and bandaged leg with a quick assessing glance that missed nothing. "Xavier, what have you gotten yourself into?" she asked, but her tone was more fond than accusatory. "This is Lydia Morgan, Ma. She needs our help." Xavier's mother studied Lydia for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Then she will have it. Bring her inside. Clara, go prepare the guest room. Thomas, help your son." Xavier's father stepped forward, and together he and Xavier carefully lifted Lydia from the wagon. They carried her into the house, through a comfortable front room filled with well-worn furniture, and into a bedroom on the ground floor. The room was spacious and light, with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt and windows that looked out over the front pasture. They settled her on the bed, and Xavier's mother shooed the men out so she could help Lydia get comfortable. She introduced herself as Rebecca Nichols and proceeded to fuss over Lydia with brisk efficiency, helping her out of her travel-stained dress and into a clean nightgown that must have belonged to Clara, checking her bandages and making sure she had everything she needed. "My son told us some of what happened," Rebecca said as she worked, "and I want you to know that you are safe here. No one will hurt you under this roof." "Thank you, Mrs. Nichols. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "You can start by calling me Rebecca. And you can repay us by healing and taking your time to figure out what you want from life. This world is hard enough on women without us making it harder on each other. We need to stick together." Clara appeared in the doorway, her arms full of blankets and pillows. "Ma, let me help. You are going to overwhelm her." Rebecca laughed. "My daughter thinks I am overbearing. Can you imagine?" "I do not have to imagine," Clara said with a grin. "I live it every day." They worked together to make Lydia comfortable, and then Rebecca went to prepare dinner, while Clara settled into the chair beside the bed. She studied Lydia with open curiosity, her head tilted to one side like a bird. "So," she said, "my brother carried you a mile through the prairie. That is quite a story." Lydia felt herself blushing. "He saved my life." Xavier has always been the heroic type. When we were kids, he was constantly rescuing things. Birds with broken wings, baby rabbits, once even a bobcat kitten. Drove Ma crazy, but he has never brought home a woman before. It is not like that, Lydia protested, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was entirely true. Clara's grin turned knowing. If you say so, but I have seen the way he looks at you, and I have never seen him look at anyone like that before. Before Lydia could figure out how to respond to that, there was a knock on the doorframe. Xavier stood there, looking uncertain. Am I interrupting? Yes, Clara said cheerfully, but I will allow it. I need to help Ma with dinner anyway. She stood and headed for the door, pausing to whisper loudly to Xavier as she passed. She is perfect for you. Do not mess this up. Xavier's ears turned red, and Lydia had to suppress a laugh. He came into the room and took the seat Clara had vacated, clearing his throat awkwardly. I apologize for my sister. She has no sense of propriety. I like her, Lydia said. She seems honest. That is one word for it. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in odd directions. I wanted to make sure you were settling in okay. My mother can be a bit intense. She has been wonderful. Your whole family has been wonderful. I still cannot quite believe this is real. It is real, Xavier said softly. And you can stay as long as you need. There is no rush, no pressure. Just take your time and heal. They talked until Rebecca called them all for dinner. Xavier helped Lydia to the dining room, supporting her weight as she hobbled on her good leg. The Nichols family sat down together around a large wooden table laden with food, and they welcomed Lydia into their circle without hesitation. Dinner was a lively affair, full of conversation and laughter and stories. Thomas told her about the ranch's history, about building it from nothing with his own 2 hands. Rebecca shared plans for expanding her garden and asked if Lydia knew anything about herbs. Clara entertained them all with an elaborate story about one of the ranch hands getting drunk and trying to ride a particularly ornery bull, and Xavier sat beside Lydia, his presence steady and warm, occasionally reaching over to help her with something, or to refill her water glass. Their eyes met more than once across the table, and each time Lydia felt that strange flutter in her chest, that sense of recognition that she could not quite name. After dinner, exhaustion pulled at her again, and Xavier helped her back to her room. He lingered in the doorway, as though reluctant to leave. Thank you, Lydia said, for everything, for saving me, for bringing me here, for giving me a chance at a life I never thought I could have. You do not need to keep thanking me, Lydia. I did what anyone should have done. But you are not anyone. You are someone special. The words were out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between them. Xavier's expression softened. Get some rest. Tomorrow, if you are feeling up to it, I will show you more of the ranch. There is a spot by the river I think you will love. He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Lydia lay in the darkness thinking about dark eyes and gentle hands and the way he said her name like it was something precious. She thought about the life she had left behind, the fear and pain and helplessness, and she thought about the possibility of something new, something better, something she had not dared to dream about. The days that followed took on a gentle rhythm. Lydia spent most of her time resting, allowing her body to heal, but she was never alone. Rebecca came by frequently with food and conversation, teaching her about the herbs she grew and the remedies she made. Clara was a constant presence, full of energy and stories, dragging Lydia into her world of horses and ranch life with infectious enthusiasm. And Xavier was there every day, sometimes just sitting with her in comfortable silence, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing. He showed her books from his small collection, and they read to each other in the afternoons. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie, simple bouquets that made her smile. He helped her practice walking as her leg grew stronger, his arm steady around her waist, his patience endless. It would have been easy to fall for him, dangerously easy. And Lydia found herself teetering on that edge, fighting against it even as she felt herself slipping further each day. She had no right to develop feelings for Xavier. He was being kind, offering charity to someone in need. Reading anything more into it would be foolish and unfair. But then there were moments that made her wonder. The way his hand would linger on hers a beat too long. The way he looked at her sometimes, like she was a mystery he was trying to solve. The way he had started finding excuses to spend time with her, even when there were surely 100 other things he should be doing around the ranch. 2 weeks after her arrival, Dr. Henderson came to check on her progress. He pronounced himself pleased with how the wound was healing and gave her permission to start moving around more, as long as she did not overdo it. Xavier took this as license to show her the ranch properly, helping her onto a gentle mare named Daisy and leading her on slow rides through the property. He showed her the river, just as he had promised, a wide, lazy stretch of water that wound through stands of willow trees. They sat on the bank and dangled their feet in the cool water, and he told her about learning to swim here as a boy, about the time Clara had fallen in and he had had to fish her out. "Were you always so protective of her?" Lydia asked. "I suppose I was. She is my little sister. It is my job to keep her safe." "Is that what I am to you? Another person to protect?" Xavier looked at her, his expression serious. "At first, maybe, but not anymore. What am I now?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "I am still figuring that out," he said finally. "But I know that when I am with you, I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be. And when I am not with you, I find myself thinking about when I can be again. Does that make sense?" Lydia's heart was hammering against her ribs. "Yes, because I feel the same way." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was rough and warm against her cheek, and she leaned into it without thinking. "Lydia," he said, her name barely more than a whisper, "I want to kiss you, but only if you want that too." "I want it," she said, her voice shaking. "I want you." He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, gentle and careful, like he was afraid she might shatter. It was Lydia's first kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more. Heat bloomed in her chest and spread through her entire body, and when she parted her lips, his tongue slipped inside, deepening the kiss into something that made her dizzy with want. They broke apart finally, both breathing hard. Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have wanted to do that since the first moment I saw you," he admitted, "even though I was bleeding and half dead in the grass. Even then, you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." They kissed again, longer this time, their hands tangling in each other's hair and clothes. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia felt transformed, like some fundamental part of her had shifted into a new configuration. She was no longer the scared girl fleeing through the prairie. She was a woman sitting beside a man she was falling in love with, and the future suddenly seemed full of possibilities. Marshal Hawkins came to the ranch a week later with news. His deputy had investigated Lydia's claims and had found several witnesses willing to testify that Edmund Morgan had indeed been negotiating with Silas Croft. The marshal had arrested Morgan on charges of attempted human trafficking, and Croft was also facing charges. The case against Lydia for theft had been dropped entirely. "You are free, Miss Morgan," Marshal Hawkins said as he stood in the Nichols parlor. "Your stepfather no longer has any legal claim on you. In fact, given his crimes, I suspect the court will be inclined to grant you access to your mother's estate, which he has been keeping from you." Lydia felt like she could not breathe. Free. She was actually free. No more looking over her shoulder, no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. Edmund could not touch her anymore. Xavier took her hand, squeezing gently. What happens to him now? He will stand trial. If convicted, he is looking at several years in prison, and Silas Croft will be shut down permanently. The judge was none too pleased to learn what was happening right under his nose. After the marshal left, Lydia sat on the porch and cried, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it felt like drowning. Xavier sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, letting her sob against his chest until she had no tears left. "It is over," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "It is really over." "No," Xavier said gently. "It is not over. It is just beginning." He was right. In the weeks that followed, Lydia felt herself unfurling like a flower that had been kept too long in shadow. She grew stronger, her leg healing until the limp was barely noticeable. She threw herself into life on the ranch, learning everything she could about horses and cattle and the rhythms of the land. Rebecca taught her to cook and to preserve food for winter. Clara taught her to ride properly and to shoot a rifle. Thomas showed her the account books and explained the business side of running a ranch. And Xavier courted her, old-fashioned and proper, asking permission from both Lydia and his parents to do so. He brought her flowers and took her on long rides through the prairie. He held her hand and stole kisses when no one was looking. He told her stories and listened to hers, learning every detail of her life as she learned his. They fell in love slowly, and then all at once, like tumbling over a cliff. One evening in late September, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier turned to her with an expression of mingled nervousness and determination. "Lydia, I have something I want to ask you, but first I need you to know that there is no pressure. If you are not ready, if this is not what you want, you can say no and nothing will change between us. You will still have a place here for as long as you want it." Her heart started racing. "What is it?" He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "My grandmother's ring," he said. "My father gave it to my mother when they got engaged, and she gave it to me last week. She said she would be honored if you wore it." "Xavier," Lydia breathed. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because you owe me anything or because you have nowhere else to go. Marry me because you love me the way I love you. Because when I think about my future, the only thing I am certain of is that I want you in it, every day for the rest of my life." "Yes," she said, the word catching in her throat. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her, deep and desperate and full of promise. When they returned to the house hand in hand, Rebecca took one look at them and let out a delighted cry. Clara whooped and hugged them both. Thomas shook Xavier's hand with quiet pride, and then pulled Lydia into an embrace that nearly cracked her ribs. They were married 6 weeks later, in early November, when the leaves had turned gold and the air had grown crisp with the promise of winter. It was a simple ceremony in the small church in the nearest town, with just family and a few close friends in attendance. Lydia wore a dress that Rebecca had made for her, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Clara stood up as her maid of honor, and Xavier's friend from a neighboring ranch served as his best man. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her like she was air and he had been drowning, and the small crowd erupted in cheers. They celebrated afterward with a feast back at the ranch, music and dancing and joy that lasted late into the night. When they were finally alone in the room that would now be theirs, Xavier took her face in his hands and looked at her with such love that it made her chest ache. "I promise I will spend every day trying to deserve you," he said. "You already do," she replied. "You saved me, Xavier. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved me right back," he said. "I did not even know I was lost until I found you." They made love that night for the first time, gentle and sweet and slightly awkward in the way of people learning each other's bodies. But it was also perfect, full of whispered endearments and soft laughter, and the overwhelming rightness of two people who were meant to be together. Life settled into new rhythms after that. Lydia became a true partner in running the ranch, her sharp mind and attention to detail making her invaluable. She took over managing the household accounts and proved to have a natural talent for negotiation, securing better prices for their cattle and horses. She and Clara became true sisters, spending hours together training horses and riding out to check on the herds. Her stepfather was convicted and sent to prison for 10 years. The court granted Lydia access to her mother's estate, which included the house in St. Louis and a modest sum of money. She sold the house, unable to bear the thought of ever setting foot in it again, and used the money to expand the ranch, buying additional acreage that Thomas had been eyeing for years. Xavier continued to work cattle drives in the summer, but he always came home to her, dusty and tired and full of stories. And every time he returned, he swept her into his arms like they had been parted for years rather than weeks, kissing her until she was breathless and laughing. Their first child, a son they named James after Lydia's father, was born in the summer of 1875. Xavier was beside himself with joy and terror in equal measure, pacing the floor while Rebecca and the midwife attended to Lydia in their bedroom. When he was finally allowed in to meet his son, he held the tiny bundle like it was made of glass, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Lydia." James was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Emma, who had Xavier's dark eyes and Lydia's stubborn determination. Then came another son, Daniel, and finally another daughter, Sarah. The house was full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Lydia had never been happier. Rebecca and Thomas age gracefully, eventually stepping back from the day-to-day running of the ranch and letting Xavier and Lydia take over. Clara married a cowboy named Matthew, who worked on a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far end of the Nichols property so she could stay close to family. The years passed, marked by harvests and birthdays and quiet moments stolen between the busyness of ranch life. Lydia watched her children grow, teaching them to read and ride and to treat others with kindness. She and Xavier grew older together, their love deepening with time into something steady and unshakable. On their 20th anniversary, Xavier took her back to the spot by the river where he had first kissed her. They sat on the bank with their feet in the water, just as they had all those years ago, and he took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The life you could have had if things had been different?" Lydia thought about the girl she had been, bleeding and terrified in the prairie grass. She thought about the long journey from that moment to this one, all the joy and pain and growth along the way. And she thought about the man beside her who had carried her to safety and then stayed to carry her through life. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "You gave me the same," Xavier said softly. He pulled her close, and they sat together in the golden afternoon light, watching the river flow past and listening to the sounds of their grandchildren playing somewhere in the distance. That night, as they lay in bed together, Lydia thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how a single moment could change everything, how the worst day of your life could lead directly to the best. She had gone into that August day in 1873 expecting to die alone in the wilderness, and instead she had found love and family and a home. She turned to look at Xavier, studying his face in the moonlight that spilled through the window. Even after 20 years, her heart still jumped a little when she looked at him. Even after all this time, she was still grateful for every moment they had together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked sleepily. "About how you carried me," she said. "That day when my legs gave out, you carried me a whole mile to safety." "I would have carried you to the ends of the earth if I had needed to," Xavier said. "I know. And that is exactly why I love you." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in the darkness. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, still holding on after all these years. And in the morning, they would wake up and do it all again, living the life they had built together one day at a time. Their children grew and had children of their own. The ranch prospered under their stewardship, growing into one of the most successful operations in Missouri. Lydia and Xavier became the matriarch and patriarch of a large, loving family. Their home always open to anyone who needed a meal or a place to stay. They grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing, but their minds sharp. They sat on the porch in rocking chairs and watched their grandchildren play, and they told stories about the old days, about how they had met and fallen in love. And always, Lydia remembered that moment when her legs had given out a mile from help, when she had been certain she was going to die alone. She remembered the sound of Xavier's voice telling her to hold on, the feel of his arms carrying her to safety. She remembered looking into his eyes and seeing her future written there, even though she had not understood it at the time. That moment had been the end of one life and the beginning of another, and every single day since, she had been grateful for the cowboy who had refused to leave her behind, who had carried her not just to safety, but into a future more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. Years continued to pass. Their children raised their own families, and the Nichols name became synonymous with integrity and hard work throughout the region. Xavier and Lydia remained partners in every sense of the word, their love a steady constant that everyone around them admired and aspired to. When Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, the family mourned together, taking comfort in the legacy he had built and the values he had instilled. Rebecca followed him 2 years later, and Lydia and Xavier became the elder generation, carrying forward the traditions and wisdom their parents had taught them. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the house bursting at the seams with family. Clara gave a toast, her voice shaking with emotion, as she talked about the day her brother had brought home an injured stranger and announced she was under their protection. "I knew right then," Clara said, raising her glass. "I knew that Lydia was going to change everything, and I was right. She became the heart of this family, the glue that held us all together." To Xavier and Lydia, who proved that love at first sight is real, even when one person is bleeding and delirious. Everyone laughed, and Lydia wiped away tears as Xavier kissed her temple. Later, when the party had wound down and most of the guests had gone home or retired for the night, they sat together on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the November chill. 50 years, Xavier said wonderingly. It does not feel like it has been that long. And yet, I cannot imagine life without you, Lydia replied. You are woven into every part of who I am. The best decision I ever made was getting off my horse that day, Xavier said. Everything good in my life stems from that moment. You were my miracle, Lydia said softly. My answered prayer. I did not even know I was praying, but you came anyway. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from decades of knowing each other completely. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness, land they had worked and nurtured and passed down to their children. Beyond the immediate property, Lydia could see lights from Clara and Matthew's house, from the homes of two of their sons who had built nearby to stay close to family. This was legacy. This was what they had built together, starting from a moment of desperation in the prairie grass. A family, a home, a love that had lasted and grown and multiplied into something that would continue long after they were gone. Xavier and Lydia lived into their 80s, defying the odds and remaining active and engaged with their family until the end. They passed within months of each other. Xavier first after a short illness, and then Lydia, her body simply giving up without her partner beside her. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a single headstone that read, "Together in life, together in eternity." Their children and grandchildren gathered at the graveside, mourning but also celebrating 2 lives well lived. The oldest grandchild, James's son Xavier, spoke about his grandparents' legacy, about the love that had been the foundation of everything their family had become. My grandmother used to tell me about the day she met my grandfather, young Xavier said, about how her legs gave out a mile from where help would be, and how he carried her the rest of that way. She said he did not just carry her body to safety, he carried her heart, her hope, her future. And he never put her down, not in all the years they had together. That is what love looks like. That is what we should all aspire to. And so, the story passed into family legend, told and retold to new generations. The story of how Xavier and Lydia met, how they fell in love, how they built something beautiful out of a moment of desperation. It became the standard against which all other love stories in the family were measured, a reminder that true love was about showing up, about carrying each other through the hard times, about choosing each other every single day. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, each generation adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation Xavier and Lydia had laid. The original house was expanded and modernized, but the room where Lydia had first stayed, where she had healed and fallen in love, was preserved as it had been, a memorial to where it all began. And on quiet August afternoons, when the sun beat down on the prairie grass and the air shimmered with heat, family members would sometimes ride out to the spot where Lydia had fallen, where her legs had given out a mile from safety. They would stand there and imagine that moment, would picture Xavier dismounting and kneeling beside an injured stranger, would see him lifting her into his arms and carrying her toward hope. It had been a moment that changed 2 lives, a moment that created a family. A moment that proved that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead directly to the best, if you are lucky enough to find someone who refuses to let you face it alone. Xavier had carried Lydia that day, but in truth, they had carried each other through 50 years of marriage, through joy and sorrow, through triumph and loss. They had been partners, lovers, best friends, and soulmates. They had built a life together that mattered, that meant something, that would echo through generations. And it had all started with a single act of kindness, a stranger choosing to stop and help when he could have just ridden on. Xavier had seen someone in need and had made the choice to care, to intervene, to carry her to safety. That choice had defined both of their lives, had shaped the future in ways neither of them could have imagined in that moment. Their love story became a beacon for their family, a reminder that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, an action, a commitment to show up every day and carry each other through whatever life brought. It was about seeing someone at their most vulnerable and choosing to protect them. It was about trust and partnership and building something together that neither could have built alone. The Nichols family continued to gather every year on the anniversary of Xavier and Lydia's first meeting, celebrating the day that had started it all. They would share meals and stories, and someone would inevitably stand and raise a glass to the cowboy who carried a stranger to safety, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept help when she needed it most. And always, at some point in the evening, someone would repeat Lydia's words from years ago, the words she had spoken on their 50th anniversary. "He was my miracle, my answered prayer. I did not even know I was praying, but he came anyway." That was the truth at the heart of their story. Xavier had been exactly what Lydia needed exactly when she needed him, and she had been the same for him, though he had not realized he was searching for anything until he found her. They had saved each other in every way that mattered, and they had spent the rest of their lives being grateful for the chance. Their story lived on, passed down through the generations, a testament to the power of kindness, of love, of choosing to care for another person even when it would be easier not to. It was a story about how a single moment can change everything, how the worst day of your life can become the beginning of your greatest happiness. And it was a story about being carried, both literally and figuratively, through the hardest moments until you were strong enough to walk on your own again. About finding someone willing to bear your weight when you could not bear it yourself, and then standing beside them and returning the favor when they needed it. Years turned into decades, and still the story endured. The ranch remained in the family, a living monument to what Xavier and Lydia had built together. And every time someone told the story of how they met, every time they spoke of the cowboy who carried an injured woman a mile to safety, they were really telling a story about love in its purest form. Love that acts, love that serves, love that carries, love that endures. That was the legacy Xavier and Lydia Nichols left behind. Not just land or wealth or even descendants, though they had all of those in abundance. They left behind an example of what two people could build when they chose each other, when they committed to carrying each other through life's trials, when they refused to give up even when things were hard. Their names were carved in stone on that hillside overlooking the ranch, but their real monument was the family they had created, the love they had shared, and the story that would be told for generations to come. The story of how Lydia's legs gave out a mile from where help would be, and how Xavier carried her the rest of that way, straight into a future neither of them had imagined, but both of them had needed more than they could have known. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, forged in adversity, and tempered by time into something precious and eternal. And it all started with one cowboy making the choice to stop, to care, to carry a stranger to safety, never knowing that in saving her life, he was also finding his own destiny. That was the true end of their story, though endings and beginnings had long since blurred together. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind something beautiful. And that, in the end, was all anyone could hope for. To love and be loved, to carry and be carried, to make the choice every single day to show up for the person you had committed your life to. Xavier and Lydia had done all of that and more. Their story was complete. Their ending as perfect as any love story could hope to be. Together in life, together in death, together in memory, and together in the legacy they left behind. Forever intertwined, forever remembered, forever an example of what true love could be when two people were brave enough to reach for it and strong enough to hold on.